The gate of Jericho is closing. You can hear it before you see it. The groan of wood, the scrape of stone, torches moving along the top of the wall like a slow constellation. And inside that wall, in a house built right into the stone itself, a woman is standing at her window with a length of scarlet cord in her hands. Her name is Rahab, and in a few hours, everything she believes about her own life is going to be wrong. Here's what most people miss about this story before it even starts. Rahab has no reason to help the men hiding on her roof. She is Canaanite. They are Israelite. Her city is about to go to war against everything they represent. By every law of loyalty, blood, and survival, she should hand them over to the king's soldiers standing at her door right now. She doesn't. This is not a story about kings. This is not a story about armies. This is not a story about the men history remembers with statues and songs. This is a story about the wives standing in rooms nobody was watching. Women whose names you may have heard once, in passing, without ever knowing what they actually did. 5 women, 5 ordinary rooms, 5 decisions that quietly rewrote the future of the entire human race. One of them laughed at a promise she thought was a cruel joke, and became the mother of a nation. One of them tied a scarlet cord to a window in a doomed city, and became the ancestor of a king. One of them buried her husband in a foreign land and chose loyalty over survival. One of them rode out alone to stop a massacre with nothing but bread, wine, and her own voice. And one of them sat in a tent-maker's shop and corrected a famous preacher's theology, quietly in private, in a single evening nobody thought to record. Stay with me, because here's the detail that should stop you cold. 2 of these 5 women had no legal right to a place in Israel's story. They were outsiders, foreigners, the kind of women a respectable genealogy simply left out. But one of them, you won't guess which until the very end, ends up named directly in the bloodline of Jesus Christ himself. We'll get there. But first you need to understand where this pattern begins. Not with a king, not with a prophet, with an old woman laughing in a tent at a promise she was sure could never come true. Her name was Sarai, before God changed it, and by the time this story really begins, she is old. Not old the way we use the word carelessly today. Old the way a body is old when every possibility of a future has quietly closed, one birthday at a time, until only the closing remains. Decades earlier, a promise had been made to her husband Abraham, that his descendants would outnumber the stars. You can imagine what that promise sounded like to Sarah after 10 years, after 20, after a lifetime spent watching that promise age right alongside her, until it looked less like a gift from God and more like a joke at her expense. So when 3 visitors arrive at Abraham's tent and one of them says that within a year, Sarah will hold a son in her arms, she doesn't cry. She doesn't fall to her knees in gratitude. She laughs. The Hebrew word used here is tzachak, and it is not a polite chuckle. It's the laugh that comes out of you when something so far beyond possible that your body reacts before your mind can catch up. It's disbelief wearing the shape of a laughter. And God asks a question that echoes across the rest of Scripture. Is anything too hard for the Lord? A year later, Sarah is holding her son. They name him Isaac, from that same Hebrew root, tzachak. His name literally means he laughs. Every time Sarah says her son's name for the rest of her life, she is saying, God turned my disbelief into joy. Here's the pattern nobody tells you. God's biggest promises rarely land on people who feel ready for them. They land on people who've stopped believing they're even possible anymore. Now back to Rahab, standing at her window with that scarlet cord. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing centuries later, described the culture of Canaan that Rahab lived inside. A world of walled cities, competing kings, and a woman like her occupying one of the lowest rungs of that society. She ran an inn built into Jericho's wall. She had no husband advocating for her, no tribe backing her, no army she could call on. When 2 Israelite spies show up at her door, the king's men are only minutes behind them, and Rahab does something that should terrify you if you understand what's actually at stake. She hides them. She lies to armed soldiers standing in her own doorway, and she asks the spies for one thing in return, that when Jericho falls, her family will be spared. They agree. She ties a scarlet cord to her window as the sign, and this is where it gets remarkable. When the walls of Jericho collapse, every family inside that city dies. Everyone, except a Canaanite woman running an inn, and everyone standing behind her scarlet cord. Rahab bet her entire life, and the lives of everyone she loved, on a promise made by 2 strangers hiding on her roof. She had no covenant with their God, no history with their people, just a decision made in one terrifying night. Hold that thought, because it matters more than you think right now. Years later, a widow named Ruth stands at a fork in the road outside Moab, watching her mother-in-law Naomi prepare to walk away from her forever. Naomi has lost everything. Her husband, both her sons, including the one Ruth married. She's telling her daughters-in-law to go home, find new husbands, rebuild their lives. It's the practical advice. It's the safe advice. One daughter-in-law takes it and leaves. Ruth doesn't. What she says next has been spoken at gravesides and weddings for 3,000 years. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. The Hebrew word behind that loyalty is chesed, and it's bigger than the English word loyalty can hold. Chesed is covenant love, the kind that keeps a promise long after the situation that created the promise has fallen apart. Ruth owes Naomi nothing anymore. Her husband is dead. The legal bond between them has already ended. She stays anyway, so Ruth leaves behind her own country, her own gods, her own family, and walks into Bethlehem as a foreigner, a widow, and a woman with absolutely nothing to offer except her loyalty. 3 women, 3 rooms nobody else was watching, and not one of them looked in the moment like she was about to change the future of the entire world. Here's the pattern so far, if you're keeping track. An old woman laughs at an impossible promise and becomes the mother of a nation. A foreign innkeeper ties a cord to a window and becomes the reason her whole family survives a massacre. A grieving widow refuses to walk away and becomes the great-grandmother of a king. None of them were standing in a palace. None of them had an army. Every single one of them made her decision in a small room that nobody outside that room was paying attention to. If you're seeing the pattern too, hit subscribe, because it's about to get even more remarkable. The next wife on this list doesn't just survive a crisis. She rides straight into one alone to stop a king from becoming a murderer. A man named Noble is about to get every single person in his household killed. He just doesn't know it yet. Here's the situation. David, not yet king, still on the run, still leading a band of several hundred armed men through the wilderness, has spent months protecting Nabal's shepherds and flocks out in open country. No theft, no harassment. David's men acted, in his own words later, like a wall around Nabal's property night and day. So when David sends messengers asking for a small gesture of hospitality during a sheep shearing feast, a reasonable request by the customs of the time, Nabal insults them to their faces. He calls David a runaway servant. He refuses to give so much as a crust of bread to men who protected everything he owns. David's response is immediate, and it is not measured. He straps on his sword. 400 armed men mount up behind him, and David makes a vow. By morning, nobody in Nabal's household will be left alive. This is the moment that matters, not the insult, not the anger. What happens in the next few hours before sunrise, in the gap between Nabal's stupidity and David's rage? A servant runs to Nabal's wife, Abigail, and tells her everything. the insult, the danger, the 400 men already moving toward the estate. And Scripture describes Abigail in a way it rarely describes anyone. Intelligent and beautiful. Not just beautiful. Intelligent first. She doesn't wake her husband. She doesn't call a family meeting. She acts alone, immediately, without permission from anyone. Abigail loads donkeys with bread, wine, prepared grain, roasted meat, and fruit. She rides out into the hills to intercept an army by herself, with no guard, no weapon, nothing but supplies, and her own voice standing between her entire household and a massacre. Pay attention to this, because when she finally reaches David, she doesn't grovel and she doesn't panic. She speaks with a clarity that stops a future king in his tracks. She tells him essentially, don't let this be the thing you're remembered for. Don't let blood guilt follow you into the throne you're going to sit on one day. Let this be the moment you walked away from vengeance instead of into it. David listens. He calls off the attack. And later he says something remarkable back to her, that God sent her personally to keep him from committing murder with his own hands. Here's what most people miss about this story. Abigail had no legal authority to make peace on her husband's behalf, no political standing, and no army of her own. She had bread, wine, and the nerve to ride toward danger instead of hiding from it. 10 days later, Nabal dies. Struck down, Scripture says, by his own doing, and David marries Abigail. But here's the stakes escalation worth sitting with. Sarah's decision affected one family line. Rahab's decision saved one household inside one falling city. Ruth's loyalty rebuilt one widow's future. Abigail's right prevented something bigger than any of those. She stopped the future king of Israel from carrying blood guilt onto his own throne. National consequences, a king's legacy, all of it hinging on one wife's decision to act before her husband ever woke up. There's one more thing you need to understand before we go further. The pattern isn't slowing down. It's accelerating. Every wife in the story carries higher stakes than the one before her. And the highest stakes of all are still coming. Around the year 49, Emperor Claudius does something that will accidentally set up one of the most important conversations in the history of the church. He expels the Jews from Rome. The Roman historian Suetonius records the order in a single line, almost as a footnote to imperial administration. He has no idea what he's actually setting in motion. Among the people forced out of the capital of the empire are a married couple, Aquila and his wife Priscilla, tent makers by trade. Refugees, really, though nobody would have used that word. They end up in Corinth, rebuilding a business and a life from nothing. And that's where they meet a Jewish tent maker named Paul. You already know what Paul becomes. But right now, in this small shop full of leather and thread, he's just a working man sharing a trade with two other working people. Priscilla and Aquila take him in. They work alongside him. And when Paul eventually leaves Corinth, they leave with him. First to Ephesus, then eventually hosting a church in their own home. Here's the part nobody tells you about what happens next. A brilliant, eloquent Jewish teacher named Apollos arrives in Ephesus. Scripture says he's mighty in the Scriptures, an eloquent speaker, fervent in spirit. He teaches accurately about Jesus. Except for one significant gap. He only knows the baptism of John. He's missing something central to the full gospel message, and he's teaching it publicly to crowds without realizing what's missing. Priscilla and Aquila hear him teach. And this is where it gets remarkable. They don't correct him in public. They don't humiliate a gifted preacher in front of the crowd he's just addressed. They take him aside, privately in their own home, and explain the way of God to him more accurately. The Greek word used here is akribesteron. It means precise, exact, careful correction, not a public takedown. A private, patient conversation between people who cared more about the truth landing correctly than about being right in front of an audience. Notice something about the order of those names in Scripture. Priscilla is listed first, before her husband, and in 4 of the 6 times this couple appears in the New Testament. In a culture where a wife's name rarely appeared at all, let alone ahead of her husband's, that ordering tells you something about who was doing the teaching in that room. Apollos goes on to become one of the most effective preachers in the early church. Scripture says he powerfully refuted his opponents in public debate, showing from the Scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. None of that happens without one evening, one tent maker's home, one private conversation nobody thought to record in detail. Now here's where everything you've heard tonight connects. Remember what I told you at the very beginning, that 2 of these 5 women had no legal right to a place in Israel's story? Outsiders, foreigners, the kind of women a respectable family record would normally leave out entirely. Open the first chapter of Matthew's Gospel, the official genealogy of Jesus Christ, and you'll find something almost nobody expects in an ancient Jewish record. Tucked into that list of fathers and sons are 2 names that should not be there by any convention of the time. Rahab, the Canaanite innkeeper who tied a scarlet cord to her window, and Ruth, the Moabite widow who refused to let go of her mother-in-law, both of them named directly in the bloodline of the Messiah himself. Not as footnotes, not as scandals to be hidden, as ancestors, written permanently into the family record of God's own Son. Think about what that means for a moment. The genealogy of Jesus Christ runs directly through 2 women that respectable society had every reason to exclude. This is not a coincidence buried in a genealogy nobody reads. This is not an accident of record keeping. This is not a detail God overlooked. This is God signing his name generations in advance underneath every wife in this story who acted when nobody was watching. Think about the shape of what you've just heard. A husband and wife get exiled from their home by an emperor who never knew their names, and leads step by step to a private conversation in a tent maker's shop that shapes how the early church understood the gospel itself. Nobody plans a moment like that. It just happens in an ordinary room between 2 people talking quietly after the day's work is done. That's usually how it happens for you too. Not in the moment you're watching for. In the ordinary room. The one you'll only recognize as significant years later looking back. So here's what all 5 of these women leave you with. Takeaway 1. Look back across the whole story. Sarah, Rahab, Ruth, Abigail, Priscilla. Every major turn in the story of redemption ran through a wife standing in a room nobody else was watching. Not a throne, not a battlefield, a tent, a window, a road, a kitchen, a shop full of leather and thread. Takeaway 2. This means the ordinary room you're standing in right now matters more than you think it does. You may never lead an army or sit on a throne. Neither did any of these women. What you have is today's decision in today's ordinary room. And Scripture keeps insisting that's exactly where God does his biggest work. Takeaway 3, and this is the one I want you to sit with. God has never needed a palace to change the world. He's never needed a king, an army, or a headline. He has only ever needed one willing woman in one ordinary room, choosing faithfulness when nobody else was paying attention. Sarah in her tent, Rahab at her window, Ruth on that road, Abigail on the hillside, Priscilla in that shop. 5 women, one pattern. And it never once stopped being true. So here's my question for you. Out of Sarah, Rahab, Ruth, Abigail, and Priscilla, which one would you have had the courage to be? Tell me below. Because somewhere in your life, right now, there's a room nobody else is watching. And what you do in it might matter more than you'll ever know until you look back and see it.